The chair calls to order this special meeting of the Scottsdale Unified Number 48 Governing Board on October 5th, 2021. The time is 6 p.m. Vice President Sinowski, would you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Yes. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The board will now have a roll call, starting from the chair's left.
Zach Lindsay.
Libby Hart-Wells.
Julie Sinowski.
Jan Michael Greenberg. All 5 board members are present, and there is a quorum. The board will now move to agenda item 2D, approval of agenda, board action required. Are there any amendments to the agenda as presented? Just a quick note for this meeting and for future meetings, in an attempt to modify things and get us on a more streamlined schedule, we are not going to be doing as many presentations on every single item as we have been doing. So those materials will simply be posted online for the public's review as well as the board's review, and we'll try to limit presentations just to very key high-level items. With that said, the chair moves to approve the agenda as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
Vice President Sinowski seconds. It is moved and seconded that the board approve the agenda as presented. All in favor, say aye.
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 Aye. The motion carries 5-0. The board will now move to agenda item 3A, information discussion item, assessment and accountability update. Dr. Menzel.
Good evening, President Greenberg, Vice President Sinowski, and members of the governing board. Tonight, we have a data presentation related to our AZ merit scores, and Dr. Bachna is here to get us kicked off and then to engage the board in a conversation about what the data means and how it will help inform our strategies moving forward.
Thank you, Dr. Menzel. Good evening, President Greenberg, Vice President Sinowski, board members, and Ms. Wagner and Dr. Menzel. I am, like they said, Cindy Bachna, here to talk to you about assessment and accountability. So let's talk about state general education testing for a minute and look at the history of our testing and where we're going. For the past 6 years, we have taken the AZ merit. We gave this between 2015 and 2019 in grades 3 through 11 in English and math. In addition, from 2010 to 2019, we gave the Ames science assessment in grades 4, 8, and 11. In the 1920 school year, because of the pandemic, we did not have state assessment testing. It was canceled that April 2020. This previous last school year that we just finished, which we're talking about tonight, the data for, we gave what they called AZM2, which was basically AZ Merit, just renamed, in grades 3 through 8 and 10 in English and math. You'll notice the change in the high school level is that we didn't give a test in 9th and 11th grades like we did in the previous years prior to 2020, 2021. So that does affect the amount of data we have at the high school level. In addition, in 2021, we gave the field test for AZ Sci for the first time, which is the next generation of Ames science based on the new science standards that were adopted by the state. And that test was given as a field test, so there's no data provided to us. And you'll see a shift in the grade levels that are assessed. It's now being given in grades 5, 8, and 11. Going forward, this coming school year, we're going to be giving what they're calling the AASA, the Arizona Academic Standards Assessment. This test will basically look like AZM2 for grades 3 through 8, with the exception of the 3rd grade test. We'll be adding an oral reading fluency measure. High school is where the big change will come in. Our state assessment will now be in grade 11, it'll be the ACT. And in grade 9, it'll be the ACT Aspire. And you'll see that we'll be measuring English, math, reading, and science on those measures, with the interesting thing being that because of state law, we also will be giving the AZ Sci in the 11th grade. So our 11th graders are actually going to be taking 2 science tests, one part of ACT and one is part of the Arizona legislature rules. So before we get into the testing results tonight, I just want to point out this quote that I pulled from our data that they've shared online for all of us. The state has provided this caveat with regards to state testing results for the 2020-21 school year. At some point during the 2020-21 school year, all of our students were learning from home. And once schools were reopened for learning, many families elected to keep their students participating from home. This is a unique circumstance that hadn't occurred previously. As you'll see on the next slide, fewer of our older students tested than in the past. All this is to say that we should treat our data and results with an interested but critical eye, acknowledging that while the data is relevant and it can be useful, we need to recognize all the complexities that occur in the learning environment in the last school year. So let's look at our AZM testing by the numbers. Under ESSA, which is the Every Child Student Succeeds Act, the federal act, every school at every tested grade level is required to test at least 95% of all students on the annual state tests in English and math. In spring 2021, we were required to test all students, but there was no accountability penalty for not testing 95%. Generally, you can see that in the spring of 2019, we tested at least 95% of our students across all grade levels, with a high of 97% in 6th and 8th grades. But you see last spring, we didn't hit that proficiency or that test rate at our grade levels. Our highest tested grades was grade 4 with 94% tested, but you can see those numbers decreased with our older population. The 10th grade students, only 78% of our 10th graders tested last spring. Now, this is partly because a lot of our learners were learning at home and they had to come in physically to take this test. And it wasn't a one-day test, it was over several days. In this table, you are seeing a chronological list of every English Language Arts or ELA test by grade level in the leftmost column. The subsequent columns present the passing rates among first Arizona students overall, then in SUSD, and then a ranking of how SUSD results compare to 10 other school districts. The comparison districts were chosen among those in the North and East Valley, which enroll at least 10,000 students. You will see that with the exception of 6th grade and 10th grade English, our proficiency levels were among the top 2 in the other grade levels and the highest in 1st, 2nd, 7th, and 8th grades. The numbers highlighted in green indicate the highest percentage among all the districts. This next chart shows how Scottsdale ranks among the comparison districts by AZM2 performance on the math assessments, starting with grade 3 up through grade 10. There were no assessments in 9th grade. In math, our proficiency levels were the second highest in 3rd, 4th, 5th, 7th, and 8th grades. Again, the numbers highlighted in green indicate the highest percentage among all districts. So this slide shows a 4-year cohort comparison both in Scottsdale, the chart at the top of the page, and in the state data, the chart at the bottom. The leftmost red bar in each chart represents percent passing rates for spring 2017. The orange from spring 2018. The green is the data for spring 2019. And finally, in blue, the results for spring 2021. You can see that there has been a significant drop in performance over time from spring 2017 to spring 2021. In the top chart, the first comparison on the left, labeled with the number 1, shows the progression of 3rd grade 2017 students. So spring of 2017, they were 3rd graders. The subsequent year, they were 4th graders. The next year, they were 5th graders. And finally, last spring, they were 7th graders. Again, we have that gap year where we didn't have a test. During the spring of 2017, 67% of these students tested as proficient or highly proficient on the assessment. In spring of 2018, 70% of these students tested as passing the assessment. In spring of 2019, 73% passed. And in spring of 2021, when they were 7th graders, 56% passed the test. When you look at the chart below, which shows the same cohort changes over time, but among all Arizona students, you can see that the same trend at the state level, where student performance increased from spring 2017 to 2019, then declined in spring 2021. There is no cohort comparison for grades 5, 6, 7, and 9 because there was no 9th grade test in spring 2021. This next slide shows 4 years worth of percent passing by several subgroups. In the set of columns denoted with the number 1, you will see 4 years worth of students scoring proficient among our English language learners, which is labeled as limited English proficient on the English assessment. This is to all students and not particular to a single grade level. The highest proficiency among this group was 11% in spring of 2019, while the lowest was 4% demonstrated in spring of 2021. Looking at the state data for comparison, at the state level, 2% of our English language learners passed the assessment in spring 2021. And looking at the second group of data in the chart labeled at the top, for special education, with the number 2 below that grouping of bars, you can see that our percent passing among all students held steady in English in spring 2021 in comparison to the results for these same students in spring 2019, with 27% of students passing. A similar pattern emerged in the state data, although the overall percentage of special education students passing was far lower at the state level. Among our Title I population, denoted with the term low SES, our English scores in spring 2021 were the same as those in spring 2019, with 35% of our students passing the exam. At the state level, this population of students saw a decrease in scores. In math, our limited English proficient students scored significantly lower in spring 2019 than they did in spring 2021. The state data also shows a decrease in student performance among this group. Our special education students showed a slight decrease in performance between spring 2019 and spring 21 on the math test, going from 29% passing to 28% passing. Our low-income students demonstrated a decrease in performance in math, while 36% of the population passed the math assessment in 2019, 29% passed it in 2021. This decrease in performance was larger among that same population of low SES at the state level. So while the most publicized data with the state assessment are the overall test proficiency or percent passing levels, the state also provides school districts with student level growth percentile data. This chart shows the English language arts proficiency and growth results for the 2018-2019 school year. By taking this file and analyzing the median growth percentiles of all students within a school, along with the overall proficiency/percent passing rate for the school on the test, we are able to generate an analysis not only of proficiency data, but the growth data as well. What you see here along the X, or horizontal axis is growth percentile levels broken out into categories. 0 to 33 is labeled as low growth. Values between 34 and 66 are labeled as average growth. And values of 67 and higher are labeled as high. Along the y-axis are school proficiency or passing rates. The 0 to 33% is labeled as low proficiency, 34 to 66 is average, and 67 to 100 is high proficiency. The blue dot for each school represents their school pass rate and their school growth rate. Ideally, we want to see all of our schools moving towards the upper right-hand corner of this chart, and we do not want to see our schools in the lowest left-hand corner. More generally, we want to see all of our students demonstrating growth, even if they do not achieve proficiency, as this growth should ultimately lead them towards proficiency during subsequent school years. Why are we looking at 2019 on this chart? So we can see where we were pre-pandemic and where we are now on the next slide. In 2019, 7 of our schools were in the middle square with average proficiency and growth scores. 2 were on the cusp between high proficiency and average growth. 12 were in the box with high proficiency and average growth, while 1 was in high proficiency, high growth area. When I spoke to the principal of Redfield about these results in 2019 and what led her students to be both highly proficient and demonstrate high growth, she reported to me that they used data and progress monitoring to track student progress and set focused grade level goals in English and math. We did not receive student growth percentiles for high school students in spring 2019, which is why the high schools are not represented on this chart. Now let's look at spring 2021 English data by school for comparison. This is the same information as was presented on the previous slide, but updated for spring 2021 data. Notice we have more schools demonstrating low growth than we did previously. I want to point out a few things here. First, some of our schools with lower proficiency demonstrated greater growth in their population than those with higher proficiency. Among our high schools, Coronado students showed higher growth than the students at the 4 other brick-and-mortar campuses. Tonalea students demonstrated higher growth than that of several of their elementary and middle school peers. Due to the lack of state testing in spring 2020, as well as changes to the high school testing, there are less data points included in the median growth percentiles than were previously available for elementary and high schools. For elementary, this data is really looking at 5th grade, as they were the only ones tested pre-pandemic. For high school, this data is focused on last year's sophomore class, who tested on AZM2. Middle school data is the most complete of the data set. All student grade levels are represented in proficiency. Math proficiency and growth by school, this is again back to 2019. Note that no high schools received student growth percentiles in spring 2019, which is why they're not on the chart. In general, the majority of our schools are in the average student growth area. When I spoke with the principals of Sequoia and Desert Canyon back in 2019 about what led their students to demonstrate both high proficiency and high growth, the reasons reported to me included great teaching practices, departmentalizing students for math, and differentiating instruction with flexible groupings as students move in and out of various support needs. Again, setting SMART goals was mentioned as well. And finally, math proficiency and growth by school for 2021. This data is more scattered than it was in the previous chart, but the majority of our schools are still falling into the middle of the chart, demonstrating average growth and varying levels of proficiency. Unfortunately, the state did not calculate growth percentiles for math for high school for spring 2021, so they are not represented here. Here is a comparison of 3rd grade English proficiency or percent passing rates on AZM2 in relation to the school's percentage of low SES students. Along the X or horizontal axis is the school percentage level of students classified as low income during the 2019-2020 school year. This was the last school year where families were required to apply for lunch assistance prior to the pandemic. Along the Y or vertical axis are the overall percent of students testing as proficient on the 3rd grade ELA test in spring 2021. The line represents the line of best fit for the data. This is being shared to demonstrate that there is a strong correlation between student socioeconomic status levels and percent proficient as measured by the state assessment. It's also useful for schools to follow the trajectory of scores among schools with similar economic profiles. This is also why an analysis of proficiency levels along with growth percentiles provides better context than just looking at the percent passing or proficient. While examples are being provided here, these charts are created for every test and will be shared with our principals. Here is the same comparison, but for 8th grade math proficiency or percent passing rates on AZM2 in relation to the school's percentage of low socioeconomic status students. Again, we see the significant correlation between school socioeconomic status and student performance on this assessment. And finally, a comparison of 10th grade English scores and socioeconomic status levels by school. While the 2 schools on the farther right of this chart have similar demographics in terms of socioeconomic status, proficiency at one school was higher than the other as measured by the 10th grade English AZM2 in spring of 2021. Now that we've been through the data, we need to consider next steps. First and foremost, there are ongoing data discussions with school leadership surrounding data points and usage. This Thursday, this discussion will continue at the all administrator meeting. Next, we continue to discuss the work of the Strategic Plan Committee and the data being used for goal setting in that group. Finally, the Data Dashboard project is underway and will provide a comprehensive picture of student achievement and needs beyond just a single data point of a state standardized assessment. While we respect the importance of state standardized achievement results in giving us the ability to see how we compare to our peers around the state, we also recognize that this is just one piece of the puzzle from a single data point in time during the previous school year. Our current assessment data And FastBridge and iReady really allows us a greater understanding of student achievement along with our student strengths and weaknesses at a far more detailed level than that is provided by the data tonight. Finally, I'd like to conclude with a brief update on state accountability labels. For the last decade, our schools have received state accountability labels in the form of letter grades. Schools did not receive a letter grade in the 2019-2020 school year or last school year, 2020-21, due to the pandemic. It is currently expected that schools will receive a letter grade in 2021-2022 based on student achievement during spring 2022 testing, unless the state legislature votes to pause the labels for another school year. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you. Are there any board member questions or comments? Vice President Zanowski.
Dr. Bachna, thank you for putting all this before us. I just want to note that I know there's no teacher out there that wants to see their school performing at low levels. They don't want to see their students at low proficiency levels. So I ask, how are you talked about the KPIs. I appreciate that. I think SMART goals and establishing high standards for all of our students is vital. This is a unified school district. I do understand it's not a uniform school district, but as a unified school district, how are we using this information to ensure that the best practices, the practices that show the best results for student growth, and it's not just based on a test score, but how are we ensuring that these practices are shared and the systems that are in place in the effective and the proficient schools, how those are replicated?
I'd like to look to my colleagues. Dr. Hollygott was just talking with some people today, and so I think she might have something to say about this.
I'll make it all the way to the podium here. Hi, and thank you for the question. We are working on principal learning communities, and this data is being shared at the elementary level, and we have the opportunity to discuss ways that we can have principals share specific strategies so that we can learn from one another and we can bring these strategies back to the site. And so for us, it's very important to make sure that we have those vetted strategies come to other sites that allow us to really increase that growth. Again, proficiency is key, but showing that growth is what we're aiming for. So in the next few principal professional learning community meetings, we'll be able to dive deeper with the data and determine what are some of these goals that we have for ourselves district-wide so that we're not leaving it to chance. It's too important for us to do so.
Respectfully, if I may, I'm going to give you some pushback on that because you're talking about site-level administrators leading these discussions. They're not the ones working with the students. So how are we ensuring that the teachers that are having the best results are able to share with other educators some of their practices? And then I ask another question, is this potentially systemic? Are we looking at class sizes? Are we looking at additional supports available on particular campuses and in particular communities? Are there extracurricular academic activities available for students throughout our district? You know, we can have discussions, but none of us are in the classroom working with kids.
So to answer the first part of your question, it's our leadership that brings it forward so that we can highlight those areas, and then that expands then to our teachers so that we provide those opportunities. We're very early in our work, and so I don't want to stand here and promise things that we are not right now delivering, but we're working to get all those areas that are highlighted across our district so that then that same work can be shared at other sites, and eventually it gets to our teachers so that they're able to support the work for our students.
Dr. Hollygott, can I add? Thank you so much. So it's a great question, Vice President Sanowski. And for the first time in SUSD, you explained that we are a unified school district, and we do want to honor some site autonomy. But also, we have assessments for the first time that are common in all of our schools. with the implementation of FastBridge, with the implementation of iReady, I can tell you what the oral reading proficiency is in schools across the district, kid by kid. And with the building of the data dashboard, we have the data now, we just want to organize it so it's at teachers' fingertips. So when you ask us what teacher is getting it done, what strategies are working the best, we have common data now that we can say, we look at all the third graders and we are seeing pockets of excellence here and here. What are they doing differently? What strategy are they using? This is the data that Dr. Hagegott's principals are diving into because we want to duplicate what is best. Before, it was more difficult to make these decisions because we had a plethora of assessments that were sometimes unique to each site. In addition, we're really holding hard and fast to our expectations. So when we planned the summer programming, we only approved programming that had a pre and a post. I just met with our math secondary coach today, Lindsay Gilbert, and she said, I learned so much from what we did this summer in middle school math intervention, and I'm already working on what it's going to look like next year. And that is because we're using the data to improve student achievement. With our ESSER proposals, we're not approving any proposals that don't have a pre and post, because once we find out what's working, we can expand and we can duplicate. We are most concerned with ELA at the elementary level, math at the secondary level, our ELL students and special ed students. Though our students in special education performed, in most cases, double the proficiency of the state average, that is not good enough for us, and we're going to continue to provide excellent instruction and intervention, working hand in hand with Margaret Cerna to find out why this is working. So there's many layers to this, and we promise we are attacking it with what each student deserves.
I appreciate that input. I want to make sure that teachers are at the front of these discussions, and not just discussions, but the fact that we will then be flexible enough as a system to allow practices that are proven to be effective in one community to be attempted in another community. And then maybe we look at our school year differently and our offerings, even, time on task and instruction. I mean, with teacher input, I think this is vital to address this, because this is many years of data here, and I don't think this is a surprise so much to those that have had their sensors into education. I mean, we know we have issues, and we can continue to talk about them. I prefer if we help our students kind of rise above this data that we're seeing here in Scottsdale schools. Thank you. Thank you.
Board Member Beckman and then Board Member Hartwells.
Okay, so I appreciate it as well, in the essence of transparency, seeing where we are. There's some disappointing areas here. I sat here a year ago, and I saw data from the LES students that was extraordinarily concerning, and I'm not seeing any difference now. I know we're in the middle of a pandemic, whatever, but as Board Member Vice President Tanowski pointed out, we can look at data all day long. I want to see the implementation. What are we doing? I would love to see what these targeted interventions are going to be for these specific students. And if that means having some of our educators come up here and talk about what they're doing that's working, or the principals or whatever, I'd like to hear it, because I don't want to wait another year to look at more data and see that we did not move the needle at all. Because, again, I've seen a lot of presentations about this, and it's great to know where we are, but what are we going to do about it? And I know you've talked about it, Dr. Guerin, I appreciate that, but I really would like to see some more specificity as far as it relates to some of these groups.
Understood.
I agree, and this is one test, one data point in time. Right. When we have Margaret Cerna speaking about Move On When Reading and the number of ELL students that received the one-on-one tutoring and what oral reading fluency proficiency growth that they developed. How are the students performing on the Azella test? So we can provide deeper data dive related to specific programs and specific subgroups that you're concerned about. Mm-hmm. And my goal, our goal, is to get that on this data dashboard so you can have that information in real time instead of waiting for us to deliver it for you.
And that would be great, because as I hear about all this work that's surrounding the KPIs and whatnot, I would love to see a presentation next year showing what you presented to us this year, where you made the progress, et cetera, and what worked, and replicate it again. Because again, I don't want to sit in here another year from now and see that we're in the same place that we were 12 months prior.
I
So,
couldn't
thank
agree
you.
more. Thank you.
Board Member Hartwells.
Thank you, President Greenberg. Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Bachna. I acknowledge you're driving home a comprehensive data analysis that's important, and how the administration is approaching strategies that enhance teaching and learning rather than maybe a single state assessment. Fair enough. That seems appropriate. What does this do to the information presented about a month ago, wherein a 10% increase in select tests were proposed as a means to monitor progress using the ESSER funds? I mean, I don't see that as anything different than what you're presenting now, which does not, I wouldn't say it corroborates a 10% increase in test scores. Seems like the right approach. So if you could just comment on that. And where I'm going with this is, all of these comprehensive data points are very important, and I agree. I think this is the right approach, but it only is going to be helpful if we can analyze the whole bucket of it and bring it back to implement strategies using that information as an analysis, as opposed to the data, the results of the analysis. Can you just comment on how this presentation informs the preliminary presentation that was made a month ago on the 10% increase for the test scores, that as I was on record not liking?
So the data presented a month ago was looking at the spring 2021 scores, particularly among our English language learners, and that's shown on the presentation tonight. So at that point, the slide said of less than 5%, which is where you're seeing the 4% in my presentation tonight, of students passing the English language arts assessment in the spring of 2021 among that population.
So that's not what I'm asking. I appreciate that there's a single data overlap. Okay. What I'm asking is the approach you're using here, that I understand, that as I understand you're proposing, the approach you're using as a district-wide analysis to improve proficiency and growth for all students, is different than what was presented as the approach that was going to be used to identify successful ESSER-funded proposals to address learning loss.
Dr. Bachna, can I jump in? Okay. So thank you, Dr. Hartwells. Excellent question. So when we talk about the key performance indicators, those are drafts. We would like feedback from the board. And also, our strategic planning process is going to help guide those. So those are a first try, but all of that is coming together to develop our final KPIs. When we look at the KPIs, that is for a whole subgroup. So when we talk about 10% improvement of a whole subgroup, that is different from the amount of growth for every single student. We are working toward more than 1 year's growth for every student. So if a student is 3 years behind in math, we do not want to just make 1 year's gain for that student. We can't. We have to close the gap. It needs to be more aggressive. So when you talk about a 10% growth in a subgroup, that actually could be much more per student, depending. And maybe Dr. Bachna, you're the statistician, you can explain what that could mean overall growth percentage versus the subgroup that would be 10% altogether. I hope I'm making sense.
So yes, it's going to take more for our students to pass the test, to increase by 10% up to a 15% passing rate on that assessment. We have to look at our different strategies and what we're working with these students, but it's a big change to get from less than 5% to 15%. It's a 200% increase if you think about the amount of change over 5% to 15.
Yes, thank you both for your responses. I feel like there's a disconnect to what I'm asking. I appreciate that the ESSER funding presentation targeted certain subgroups, certain demographic of students. I don't understand, why would you use a different analytical approach in assessing efficacy of teaching strategies based on what we heard tonight as a district-wide, all students assess the whole system, versus subgroups of students assess deployment of certain funds? It seems like, to me, you would use the same comprehensive analytical approach to identify effective strategies, regardless of who the demographic is. And maybe I'm misunderstanding, if so, I apologize, but I'm trying to reconcile in my head, why are there two different approaches? And maybe there aren't, but that's what I'm hearing.
So this is not the presentation tonight is not a recommendation for how you use the data. It's a presentation of the data and different ways of looking at it. At our board retreat, we'll have even more data to share related to student performance on a number of indicators. It's information that has been shown in draft to the Strategic Planning Committee. It's been used to help ask more informed questions. There's a lot of data that exists in addition to this one-time state assessment data. The KPIs that were presented a month ago related to ESSER funds were draft because we know that that's an important conversation to have at the governing board table related to how we will hold ourselves accountable for improved student achievement. So that was put on the table for initial conversation, not as a final determination of where we should be. In an ideal world, we would have had our board retreat in August. We would have had these conversations at that point in time in order to be able to set goals for this current school year. We're not there yet, but that's what we'll have at our October retreat. The other part that it's been alluded to a couple of times here is that the board agreed to invest in a data dashboard, which will allow us to look at student-level data, classroom-based data, grade-level data, building data, and district data. We need to be able to ask and answer intelligent questions. Sometimes what's going on is systemic in nature. Do we have the right curriculum? Is that part of our challenge? Is it about how we're delivering the curriculum? Do we see differences between classrooms in the same building so that we can learn from what is working from a teacher's vantage point? Sometimes it really is student-specific. So in order to be able to implement the right kinds of interventions, we need data at all those different levels. And we haven't had a consistent way of capturing that up until now. So that's what will be as a part of our next presentation on the data warehouse, is how we're pulling all of that together to help ensure that we set meaningful and measurable growth targets for all of our students. One of the things that we talked about is 100% of our students will show more than a year's worth of growth. I mean, there's a way to frame the conversation so that we're not lowering expectations. We have and hold high expectations for all of our students. At the same time, we recognize we're serving them how they walk in the door, and they come in at all levels of preparedness. As you know from research, if we have students who are in high-stress environments, when you have elevated cortisol, your ability to master complex content is significantly compromised. So how are we addressing the needs of the whole child? How are we modifying our professional practices when we know that there are certain strategies that work? And what you want to look for in the data are positive deviance. Where are people, students, outperforming what you would expect? And then how do we replicate that? Because that ultimately is going to be a key for us in terms of elevating achievement levels for all of our students. So these are all starting points. One of the things that I heard when I was hired is that Scottsdale Unified doesn't look honestly at its data. We're trying to present an honest picture of where we are. This is a status assessment of where our kids were post-pandemic. You didn't have a test the year of 2021. We had, or 1920. You had the test the year before in the spring of 2019. You're comparing post-pandemic, and I say post-pandemic and put it in quotes because we're still in the middle of the impact of COVID. It has had a disruptive impact. So this is just an assessment of where we are on state-level data. One indicator, we have more indicators to share. We aspire and expect that we will have high expectations for all of our students. We'll provide support for our teachers. We'll provide support for our building principals and leading achievement for our students. And so we just want to be sure that there's clear understanding of what this state-level data looks like for Scottsdale. There are other data components that we'll be reviewing with the governing board as well, with the goal of establishing meaningful measures, but recognize that what's happening in the classroom every day, teachers are assessing students both in a formative way, and then end-of-unit assessments might give them some sense of where they are at each quarter or at the semester. And then they're always recalibrating to say, what do we need to be doing differently to help them be successful? And where teachers are struggling with that, that's where we as people in the central office are working to use the data to say, okay, what other professional development, what kind of support can we provide so that in every classroom across the district, our students are getting the support they need to master the content and demonstrate proficiency.
So thank you. I think it's helpful, although I just want to drive home the point I'm trying to make, and that is from an analytical data analysis perspective only, let's just say, that the analysis be holistic in nature regardless of kind of the context, whether it's ESSER funding assessments or whether it's this assessment. And I appreciate this as a snapshot, but the snapshots are only meaningful if we're going to do something about it. And I think that's what you're hearing from the board is we're ready for the let's see the implementation strategies. What do those look like? I just want to make one observation. Your linear regression maps identify and quantify yet again an opportunity gap exists in this district, and we need to tackle it. There also was something also glaringly obvious in this set of data, including in the ESSER funding data, and that is our English language learner students are not being targeted for enhancement. That those numbers, again, are really, really unfortunately low. So I think there is some takeaway right away from these two data sets we've seen in the last month that the administration can tackle without waiting for continued conversation and analysis. That would be my observation, at least, based on what you've presented. And I appreciate that you presented that. I also loved your, I will call them a constellation map because it looked like a constellation to me, of your proficiency and growth graphs. Thank you.
Board Member Lindsay.
Yeah, do you know how our participation rates compare with the districts that you have on this chart?
You know, I'd have to look into it. That's a really good question.
Because I know on the ADU website, it had a big disclaimer that
Yep.
the lower the participation rate, these numbers don't really mean much. And the one that really sticks out is 10th grade for us. Why do we seem to have such a hard time with our 10th graders?
I would say, again, we were asking kids to come in and take a test, and a lot of them were learning at home, and a lot of them probably did not elect to come in. And I know our schools did a very good job of outreach and did the best they could, but the catch is if they didn't finish the test, if they showed up for one day but didn't show up for the next day, they don't get a score. So we probably have some of that occurring as well. That's just my understanding of what happened out there.
Mm-hmm.
So some of our schools had better participation rates than others, but yes, 10th grade was lower.
Yeah, I mean, 10th grade would seem to be the one. I mean,
Right.
DM was at 71, Saguaro 76%. So the high schools. Is the
Absolutely.
10th graders. Yeah, because it dragged us down. I see a lot of 1s and 2s, which is nice, but cumulatively, we're third. When we look at percent passing, it's all factored in. The other thing is on the SUSD 4-year trends by demographics. The ELA special ed from 19 to 21 is 27% on both years. It's
Right.
the same thing on ELA low SES. It's 35 and 35. And then on math special ed, it's 29, 28. Just seems like an odd anomaly.
That's so similar.
Yeah, did the internal data, the benchmark data back that up? I mean, just a weird how they're all the
All
same.
consistent.
Yeah.
I'll have to look back into that.
Okay.
Thank you for asking that.
And then on the one with our Title I schools all lumped together,
Yes.
what can we do from an equity perspective or a different approach to provide support and resources for them to move off that being grouped like that?
So I think there are a couple of things, and it actually dovetails into the AFR presentation and the school-by-school analysis. So we look at resource allocation as part of that. The other thing that is not in our data tonight, but that I think is important to review is if our title schools, and I don't know the answer to this, have newer teachers. You know, the first 4 years, that's a learning experience. And if they move from a title school after the first 4 years to a non-title school and we continue to have churn, that impacts the numbers that you see in student achievement. Other countries have figured out ways to create incentives for more veteran teachers to spend a period of time in title schools so that you can show improved achievement, because, you know, veteran teachers have learned many of the tricks of the trade that it's harder for a new teacher. So we're going to be looking at that data as well to say, is there something going on there that impacts those scores as well?
I would just hope, because
Yep.
the ESSER money that we have is because of our Title I students. And so
Right.
we can figure out a way to get this from being so separated like it is.
Absolutely.
And then on the quadrants, I was more looking at the 2019 data, because 2021, all the various factors that went into play. But it's nice that we have Redfield in the high proficiency, high growth, and then on math, we have Desert Canyon Elementary and Sequoia. What can we do to get more
Right.
of those schools in the middle moved over to the right?
Exactly, and I think that's some of the stuff I addressed that I was hearing about, you know, setting goals and being continuous monitoring, differentiating instruction as needed. I think those were the kind of the things that stood out, and great teaching. Those are the main things I was hearing when I talked to those campuses.
Can I add one more thing that we didn't talk about yet, but I think it's still relevant? When our students take assessments, depending on where they are in the educational journey, they may be more or less invested in doing well on the test. So we've heard from students here, one, there are a lot of assessments, and then why do I need to do well on it? What's the impact? State assessment doesn't impact their grade. State assessment doesn't impact scholarships. And so we need to have a conversation about how do we ensure that, you know, students are bringing their best to the table when they're doing this, reflects on us, but for them, it's a so what factor. And so that's one of the things that we have to unpack a little bit as well. When it comes to ACT or SAT, different conversation, because money's attached to that and potential college acceptance. So it's just, you triggered that with some of your questions. I think that elementary kids, they generally try to do well regardless, unless there's test fatigue. That might be an issue. But older kids, it's sort of like, well, why?
Well, and it's a problem with
Yep.
middle schools everywhere. So how do you incentivize
Right.
them to want to actually
Do well.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Are there any other board member questions or comments? Dr. Menzel, thank you for pointing out that last point, because these exams have in large part no bearing on our students whatsoever. And because of the timing of when we receive results, we cannot make it part of their grade as an end-of-year assessment. So our teachers or staff are left with having to make end-of-year assessments on their own that make or that determine a student's grade. So that is abnormal in most high-performing school systems, and that does present a difficulty here. And I think the clearest factor is you bring up the ACT. ACT is an excellent exam because that's a nationally normed exam, although it only tests 3 subject areas or assesses 3 subject areas. But if you compare what our rates were of the percent of students meeting college readiness when it was a voluntary exam compared to when it is now, dramatic drop, because again, those were students who voluntarily took the exam and wanted to take it probably for college admission or some other purpose, and had an incentive and an internal incentive, not just an economic one, to perform well. So, you know, that is a difficulty we face here, and it is also concerning that we don't have exams or standardized exams for anything other than English, math, and science, because we do teach so many other critical subjects, music, fine arts, performing arts, just everything we do. So that would be nice for the strategic planning team and our administration to discuss some work on. And I would also like to highlight your comment again on the teachers and the incentives of staff, qualified staff, veteran staff, moving to doing a rotation in Title I schools to bring that expertise and guidance for a period of time as something else that the strategic planning team and administration can work on now. I mean, there are things that Mark Tucker highlights that, you know, we could pilot at certain schools or certain principals may wish to attempt at this time. So that is true. And I do agree. It's time for action. I think unfortunately, COVID in March 2020 really threw off the work that we were about to get underway. The key performance indicators, whatever those final key performance indicators are really the only way we can have accountability, because otherwise we have nothing to measure. I mean, we've looked at very similar charts every single year. We've never had a concrete goal, though, of what they should look like as opposed to what they do look like. So I'm very thankful for that discussion, and I hope something very fruitful comes out of it. Are there any final questions or comments on this matter? Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
The board will now move to agenda item 4, action items. 4A, approval of fiscal year 2020-2021 annual financial report. Dr. Menzel.
Thank you, President Greenberg and members of the governing board. Each year, the CFO presents the annual financial review, and it's a comprehensive data set that has to be submitted by October 15th. In addition, last year we had these two presentations separate because it was our first year to report the school-by-school data. So that's all combined into this one report. That's why it can't be in 5 slides, and I'm going to turn it over to Shannon Crozier to walk us through the details.
Yes, good evening, Board President Greenberg, Vice President Snowski, members of the board, Dr. Menzel, and guests. I'm going to apologize now. This is a really long presentation. There's just no way to put a whole year's worth of financial data and 2 massive, massive reports into one really small presentation. So I'm going to apologize for that now. But I will say there is a lot that goes into this. There's a lot between these 2 reports, and there is really good information that we want to be able to share. So with that, as was stated, we do this every single year. Basically, it looks at what are our revenues, what are our expenditures, how did we spend our funds. The annual financial report is really just looking at it district-wide. Last year was the first year we started the school-by-school report, which then breaks it down by school to see where those things fall. It is required to be done, and it is required that we do this by October 15th. Just kind of a quick overview of last year. Our ADM was $19,854. Base level, so amount that we get per weighted student, was $4,359, giving us an M&O budget of almost $168 million for M&O. Capital budget, $23.8 million, and federal projects at $37.8 million. That's just a quick snapshot. We did provide you guys with all of the board members with the AFR, but this is looking at the summary sheet. And the numbers we've added on there to kind of explain how to read this summary sheet. So the first one being the fund or program, beginning balance, which plays in with cash, revenues, transfers, budgeted expenditures, and actual expenditures, and then the ending fund balance. And one of the things I want to really point out, and we'll talk about this when I look at the M&O, but when you're taking a look at this, we have cash accounts and we have budget accounts, M&O being a budget account. And so one of the things to keep in mind when you look at this is looking at it going, oh, well, M&O says that there's $22.7 million. That's cash. It doesn't mean that I have that much to carry over. It's a budgetary formula. So we'll kind of take a look at that. But when you're talking about cash accounts like instructional improvements, IGA funds, that's a cash account. So the cash that we have on hand is what we have to play with to move forward with what we budget and what we can do in that year and moving forward. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how to read what you're looking at within that AFR summary page. So within the budget, M&O being the key one, our expenditures were our budget was $167.9 million. Our actual expenditures were $151 million, leaving us with a carryover balance of $16.7 million. One of the things I want to point out, that is much higher than we generally roll over. It's higher than I actually anticipated it being. But a couple things came into play last year that have raised that up more so than what is normal. First of all, we got the Enrollment Stabilization Grant because we had lost a tremendous amount of ADM from what we anticipated, at least at the early part of the year. That was $9 million. So we moved over $9 million of expenditures from M&O over to a different grant that frees up funds in M&O. Additionally, because in December we were looking at things going, our ADM is very low. We have a lot of additional expenses at that time that were coming through. We did some other things to balance the budget out. We moved $2 million from capital over to M&O. We had funds, we had 1.1 million sitting in new school opening that we moved from that back over to M&O. So there were things that we purposely did early on in the year to bridge the gap of what we were anticipating happening that really play into why we ended up with such a large carryover for this year. That's one of the things we'll look at when we're looking at the budget for next year, is how do we address that? Do we think it'll be that amount? Do we think it'll be a lesser amount? But that's one of the things that'll be addressed, and what do we do, and how do we account for that? Because that is an awfully large budget balance carry forward to have. And so we need to address what are the best ways to deal with that, so that we're taking care of our staff. This next one is just looking at community schools. Again, it's just how to read the report. We just happen to pick community schools. So they began the year with 3.3 million. Revenue was 3.3. We actually moved expenditures out because their revenue was so much lower than it has been in the past. Their expenditures generally are more in the $6,000 range, or $6 million range. Their revenue is generally more in the $6 million range. So we did move expenditures out of there and over to the ESSER fund to help balance out their huge loss in revenue for the year. But that helped them out to end the year with a $4.3 million balance. Next, we get into classroom spending, which is kind of the big thing we like to look at. I will say that this is an estimate. This report doesn't come out from the state until March. We're generally pretty close on our estimates, but it is just an estimate looking at, of our spending, how did we break it down? So I'm happy, based off of what we see, that again, we see continued increase in the classroom, increase in student support, instructional support, plant operations going down a little bit. I think some of that has to do, again, with moving some funds around, but plant operations went down, which is really good because we need to get that down. That's a little bit higher than normal for us, but that's just because we have schools with lower student enrollments in them. Again, administration is staying about the same, food services. So the nice thing about that is it does look like over the past couple of years, we've really made some dents in the things that we needed to lower, and we've increased the areas that we needed to increase. This just takes a look at of our M&O expenditures. So where's the classroom report that we just looked at? That looks at all kinds of funds. It looks at M&O, it looks at grants, it looks at classroom site fund, all the various funds. This is just looking at M&O. How are we spending our M&O dollars? And the bulk of it is going into salaries and benefits, which we know to be true. 88% of that is salary and benefits. That's why when we talk about the dollars that we have, so much of it goes to salaries and benefits. Making adjustments in other places to have more to put towards salary and benefits doesn't make much of a dent when we're trying to figure out how to get more into those areas. And then within our M&O salaries, this just breaks down where we are with that. Certified being 68%, classified being 19% of that, and administrative being 13%. And again, that's just looking at M&O. Most administrative positions are paid out of M&O. School by school report. So I'm hoping I might need some help from the magic technicians in the back, but we have an Excel sheet that I'm going to try to bring up here. Let's see if I can go this way. And the reason I'm bringing this up is I want to show the community where will all be posted on our linked from our website where you can get to this information. But it's massive. There's just a lot in here, and there's a lot of information, and there's not a good way to present it necessarily. So what we'll look at after looking here is kind of our way of breaking it down so it's a little bit easier to read, a little bit easier to understand. There's lots of tabs in here. What I would say, and the way we pulled the information that we're going to present here, is just by clicking on this single school tab. And you can pick any one of our schools. I'm going to just pick Cochise. And it brings up, and this is looking at multiple funds, not just M&O, it brings up within the functions how much was $6,100 being salaries, benefits, purchase services, supplies, and then a total. What we really tried to do was take those functions and just give you the total, because there is just no way this will translate easily into a readable format that we could get on a PowerPoint presentation, and then there'd be, 29 of these for all of our schools. So the top part of it is expenditures and how they were spent. Breaks it down a little bit more by teacher classification, salaries and benefits for that particular school, classroom site funds, how they were spent, revenue, and a lot of the times with the revenue, we don't necessarily, if you donate a tax credit or a gift, it's recorded specifically to that school. When you talk about the funding that comes in from the state for our district, for like M&O, it doesn't get recorded to a specific school. So we kind of have to allocate it out based off of ADM. So that's what this just really does, is takes a look at the revenue if you break it down by school based off of those allocations. So from that, like I said, you could pick a single school or the school comparison tab. Breaks it down a little bit differently, but again, it's still within that function 1,000, supplies, benefits, salaries. But you can look at up to 5 schools to see that information. What we did, because this is a lot to look at and more than what can fit in an easy to read format, is take that information and break it down on a little bit easier to read. So these are the elementaries. We did mark the schools that are Title I. Schools that are Title I, there's additional funding that ends up going into them. There's additional supports and staff that end up going into those schools. So that's part of the reason why you'll see that per pupil amount. What we did for this report is basically we took the total off the report I just showed you, put it in as the school total for those functions, and then divided it out by the ADM that we have, the students that were in that school. To get basically per pupil expenditure amount based off of the expenditures and the number of kids they have. Same type of thing with the revenue, came right off of those reports, and we just allocated it out. What would it be if you divide that out by the ADM? So with that, you'll see one of the variances you'll end up seeing is like a Title I school will have a higher amount per pupil just because of the additional resources, additional staff. The other thing you'll notice is there are schools, and I'm just going to flip over to here to Hohokam. There are schools that you'll look at it and go, oh my gosh, $123,000 per student. Not really. There's a school bond that went into it. We rebuilt a school, and so there are really high expenditures that go into it that's included in the facilities and construction. So when you see those numbers, it's really because of that construction. And so there's anomalies that'll come up with things like that. Schools that have, higher, teachers with higher experience will have more additional rates per pupil. Like I said, the Title I schools will have that. But in general, as I was looking at it, it really didn't seem considerably off comparing what those dollars were between the schools. So that just takes a look at our various schools. We broke it down by the elementary schools, the K-8 schools, because that has different values with it. The middle schools, and again, you'll see a little bit higher number for some of these areas when you get to middle school and high schools to be able to look at. So I have those there. Those are posted on our website. These are things you can also pull up on the website, but I didn't necessarily, I'll wait to see if there's questions, but didn't necessarily want to spend a whole bunch of time reading every single number off of that. The other part that we wanted to share, so we talk about how do we spend the money part of it, but I think it's also important to talk about what happens on the back side of it. So we threw in a couple of things, and I admit this is just kind of the people behind the scenes, and so there's lots of groups that aren't included in this that do a ton for our schools, but this is just kind of the behind the scenes people that aren't necessarily on the school campuses, taking care of all of our staff and our 22,000 plus students. So for finance, 34,000 invoices processed, 5,669 employee personnel actions. You'll see that that hits finance, purchasing, HR. That's because multiple people touch each one of those records. In fact, HR touches it twice to be able to get an employee set up. 1.2 million in donations, and then 8,247 requisitions approved. And again, multiple people touch those looking at account codes and do we have the funding and whatnot. Payroll. Payroll has 4 people that process 67,930 paychecks throughout the school year. Again, the employee personnel action request. 2,200 employees completed their benefits open enrollment, and I touched base with them today. 2,316 were eligible, so that means that 95% of our employees did open enrollment for this current year that we're in, which is pretty impressive, I thought. Purchasing, again, 8,247 purchase orders, 13 formal bids. There's a lot of work that goes into a formal bid with getting the scope of work, advertising it, getting people to review those bids, reviewing it for accuracy, those types of things. Written quotes, they did 165 due diligence on cooperative contracts. So when we use those cooperatives, they're making sure that there's no conflict of interest, that the people that are involved are what they're offering are the right things, and that it meets what our standards are. It's quite a bit going on there. Food services, 1.8 million meals served. They were serving meals to families throughout the year, whether they were attending school or they were using 400,000 grocery bags to also help distribute that food to the community to make sure that our families in our community had breakfast and lunch. We offered dinners, snacks, so a bunch of meals offered to our families, making sure that our kids weren't hungry. The other part that I thought was really fascinating is that 120 staff members with 923 years of combined experience within food services. So that's a lot of experience. Transportation, 1,469 hours of safety training, 535 total rides, and 709,000 total route miles. And I wanted to kind of see, what does that really equate to? I mean, you throw that number, but what does that really mean? And so the circumference of the Earth is 24,901 miles. That's essentially 28.48 times around the Earth of bus miles driven last year, which, when you put it in that perspective, that's a lot of miles on those buses. And then building services, 622 acres of landscaped land, 4 million square feet of buildings cleaned, maintained, 9,322 work orders completed. So those guys were awfully busy last year as well. IT had 20,724 work orders, 874 hotspots in use, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. They did not give me all of the things that they did, but there was computers being cleaned, computers being handed out, hotspots being handed out, devices, and then of course all the technological needs that we all need to get through the day. And then human resources. Again, the 5,669 employee personnel actions approved, 712 new hires, 2,980 contracts issued. I don't know, countless orientations that were done every single week. Sometimes there's multiple within that week. So again, that group was also considerably busy on top of all the other things that they do for us. So with that, I will open it up to questions.
Thank you. Board Member Lindsay.
Yeah, really quick, what falls under central services other?
Sure. Central services is basically finance, purchasing, human resources, communications. It's actually, if you do professional development and you're not a classroom teacher, that's coded there. Warehouse.
Because some of our schools have really large dollar amounts and some are like barely anything. I mean, Mojave's is small, so like 3465.
Yeah, it depends on, like if they had professional development. So you'll see that more so I was looking at that as well. I think it's the Title I schools tend to have a higher amount for that. So I think some of that is the professional development, having them come in on some of these areas. If you're doing printing of certain things, a lot of that'll get coded to print shop. So I think it has more to do with that, not necessarily that we're coding something to finance that really isn't finance, is really a school.
The other one that stuck out was Saguaro.
Okay.
Their instruction is $508 per student.
I'm sorry, they're what?
So much lower than everybody else.
I'm gonna pull that one up.
$607,119 total.
The instructional for
For
Saguaro?
Function 1000,
Yeah,
they're like so much lower than every other school.
that is interesting.
Yeah, I think the next lowest one was 4,000 something. Yeah,
That makes me think, so here's what I'm gonna say, I'm gonna pull it up. We had to rekey this in. So that makes me think that we might have had a keying issue, but
Okay.
let me, that is the hard part, when you take that report and have to rekey everything in.
Yeah, I was thinking it might be a typo, but.
Yeah,
I thought I-
I feel very confident that it is, but we'll use that as our example here.
I think you're just missing a digit.
Yes. I apologize for that. We tried to look
No,
at this
it's okay.
over and over and over and over again, and let's pull Saguaro up as our example here. Yes, we
Makes
are
you feel
missing,
good.
it is actually $6,071,119.
Okay.
I
That's
do
better.
apologize for, that's a keying error on our side.
No, and then the only other one I have is the ADM for Copper Ridge is 536.547, and that's higher than Cheyenne. Now, I know ADM gets kind of weird with the,
Well, last year was also a weird year.
Yeah.
Because we had a lot of kids in online learning.
mhm.
Copper Ridge. $536. We have it in there wrong?
No, I think it's right. 536.547?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it just seemed odd.
Yeah, I really think last year, in so many ways, last year caused weird anomalies with what's, do school kids pick an online course, or are they doing it, or the EDL program, or were they actually in person? And so I think that's why there's just a lot of weird anomalies that happened
Yeah,
last year.
that one just stuck out.
Yeah. Cheyenne.
Nope. You're still in Copper Ridge.
Yep. Yeah,
Yeah, it's off
Okay.
on the,
I apologize.
that makes me feel better though, too. I just thought it was like stuck out, so, thank you.
We tried to catch those things, and so I do apologize.
Are there any other board member questions or comments? Board Member Hartwell's, and then Vice President Zanowski, and then Board Member Beckman, Board Member Board Member Hartwell's, and then Board Member Beckman, then Vice President
You
Zanowski.
were first. Go ahead.
I literally have the quickest question, and you may
Okay.
not answer it. The $9 million for Saguaro for the facilities acquisitions and construction. I know Innovation Center, tennis courts, which haven't been done yet, and maybe lobby, but what was $9 million in construction there? Do you remember?
Well, so last year we had the Innovation Center.
Right, that was 9 million?
Um,
I just was wondering, I was just curious.
I'd have to look to see exactly how much
Yeah,
that
I
would,
don't
but
wanna
I
put
mean,
you on the
I
spot.
do know that there were several bond projects that we did
Yeah.
last year.
I don't think it was 9 million, but I'll have Dennis.
I don't
get
think,
back to
I
you.
don't think it was a total of 9 million, but I think there was other things that, and part of it too is things cross over. So we might have finished the project at the end of the 2019-20 school year, but if the invoice doesn't, we open those POs and cross them over, if we don't necessarily get it paid until the 2021 year, then that could be part. So if there's a project we finished up late the prior year, that could cross into that as
Someone
well.
can just shoot me an email, it's not really material
Okay.
to what we're talking about tonight, I'm just curious.
Okay.
Thanks.
Board Member Hartwell's.
Yeah, I had a question on the spend under the cash accounts. Does that count towards the revenue control limit where we have a cap of what we can spend? Or that's outside?
When you're talking about M&O, it doesn't matter if our M&O budget minus expenditures left us with a balance of $4 million, but I had $10 million in cash, I still would only have $4 million that I could carry over. The cash really, it doesn't give me more or less to spend. It just means that we have the money on hand when we write checks is that not what you were asking?
I'm actually asking about, there's a state cap on how much we can spend in a year, but there are certain monies that are outside of spending. For example, results-based funding doesn't count towards a cap.
Oh, you're talking about the, you're talking about the expenditure limit.
Yes.
There is a state set expenditure limit each year. Last year, because enrollment was so low with districts across the state, that the state didn't reach that expenditure limit. If something happened and all those districts met that expenditure limit, then yes, all districts would see a reduction in their M&O budget.
Does the spend under the cash accounts, is that outside of?
The budget limit is looking at your budget, not the cash on hand. So the cash wouldn't affect that at all.
So that's also outside?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Vice President Sinowski.
Quick question for you, Shannon, if you would. Can you talk about the food services a little bit? I know that our district has received a lot of federal assistance for the meals and that students are not paying for them currently. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So how does that affect and impact our food services? Because traditionally, that has been a decent moneymaker for SUSD.
It has. So they originally started out the year very, very concerned because they started last year lower than normal. Usually they have, I want to say around $3 million on hand. Last year they started a little bit lower than that. So they were really concerned. Then the federal government came out and said, student lunches are going to be free for everyone. So that made a huge difference for them in changing the revenue where they were going to land. They landed this year at where they typically do within the $3 million mark. They were able to, because we were concerned, were they even going to be able to contribute to indirect costs? If so, would it be what they normally do? They did contribute again. Generally, they contribute $1 million. We did $750 this year, just not because they couldn't do a little bit more, but just to make sure that they were okay moving future, and then also because of we have some things that they're going to need to in the future take care of out of that budget, so they're planning ahead for the future. This year, again, school lunches are free for everyone, and so they're seeing their revenue is doing fine this year. She's feeling like things will be, again, quite well moving forward for the school year because it is free lunches, free breakfast for all of our students. And they were able to provide that this summer, which was also a great help to them to be able to, one, provide the students with free breakfast and lunch during the summer programs, which is great for the students, but it helped them out as well.
Good to know, thank you. And I really appreciate that you included these different departments that are key in the function of our school district. And I think often, those issues are forgotten, that we are a big employer in our community. And so it's important for us to continue to care for being good employers. So thank you, I'm glad you included them.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been great to include all of the great things. There's so many great things that happen with all of our employee categories throughout the district, be it teachers or other classified groups. So this is just a small sampling of those groups and what those groups do within the year.
Thank you, Shannon.
Are there any other board member questions or comments? Thank you. The chair moves to approve action item 4A as presented, approval of fiscal year 2020-2021 annual financial report, AFR. Is there a second?
Second?
Vice President Sinowski seconds. Is moved and seconded to approve action item 4A, approval of fiscal year 2020-2021 annual financial report, AFR. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The motion carries 5-0. The board will now move to action item 4B, increase to Scottsdale Unified School District substitute pay rates. Are there any questions or comments from the governing board? Board member Hartwells.
I have a question about the kind of step gradient, earned increased pay based on number of days subbed. And I know SUSD has had this for a while. My question is, does it actually incentivize subs to take long-term commitments?
Alexis, or Amy?
President Greenberg, members of the board, Dr. Menzel, Gladys. Typically, our subs work a lot over the year and it increases their rate and it's very beneficial. Since COVID, we don't have a great deal of subs engaging and moving up the pay scale. So our hope is that this increase will incentivize them to do that.
The step gradient specifically was what I was asking about. As I understand your response, which is that pre-pandemic, you did observe, at least anecdotally, that subs would take more in work through this step gradient in terms of increase of hourly pay, but that hasn't necessarily been the case in the last year and a half with the
Correct.
pandemic.
Out of our 454 subs, about 96 have engaged actively this year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Oh, excuse me. Was it 196?
If that's the case, what's the expected expend then with this proposed step gradient? I get the flat rate, daily rate, but do you have a projection on kind of efficacy, how effective this may be and what that dollar amount might look like?
President Greenberg, Member Hartwells, in working with Shannon Crozier in finance, the overall impact we think is going to be around the 340,000, looking at all of the rates that are listed on here. Specifically with the number of days that you're referencing, I'm certain that Shannon factored some of that into the calculation as well. So obviously we'd like to see more engagement from our current pool and hope that those numbers increase. So this is a first step in attempting to fill those classrooms.
Okay, so the estimated expenditure is for the entire package, not necessarily the step gradient. Okay.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other board member questions or comments? Vice President Snowski?
Can you guys share what our school districts that butt right up against SUSD, what they are paying their subs right now?
Yeah, in the study, the average for our daily rate was about 120. So that's, we came up with the 120 rate as a, hope that it would be comparable with our neighboring districts. For some districts, they're paying up to, I think the highest was $200. Not necessarily a neighboring, but I mean, people are getting that high on their daily rates. We didn't feel that it was quite necessary to go quite that far due to the fact that our neighboring districts aren't that high yet. They're about in the 120 range. For the long-term rates, again, the average was about 150, so we feel like that'll bring us comparable to that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there any other board member questions or comments? Do you find that pay is the reason why we have low engagement?
That what is, excuse me?
That
Sorry.
pay is the
Oh.
reason we have low engagement?
President Greenberg, we did a survey of our current substitute pool, and we listed a number of things as possible ways to increase participation, and increased daily rate was the top reason of the almost 200 substitutes that responded. The second was the increase for the Monday-Friday rate. I think obviously remains to be seen given that about half of our subs are engaging right now.
So when you say the substitute pool, what you're saying is that about 50% of our substitute pool is engaging, but that almost, how large is our total substitute pool? Apologies, about
450.
450, and about 200 or so who are already engaging listed pay as a reason to engage more?
That would be their top priority to engage more.
Okay. And then what about is there any comment on the other half of our pool that just doesn't engage at all anymore?
President Greenberg, it's difficult because you can't always delineate who's actually responding to the surveys because it's anonymous. Again, we sent it out multiple ways, but it's hard with substitutes who may or may not be engaging. Some of the comments by some of the respondents were a myriad of reasons as to why they're not. Their own personal COVID concerns, mask, no mask, things that they're dealing with on their own as well.
Okay, so I see. So I apologize. What I thought I heard was that we have about 50% engagement, and almost all of that 50% is who responded. But we don't know that. We sent it out to all 400 or so in the pool, and we got about 200 plus engagements. Okay. Thank you. Are there any final questions or comments? Vice President Sanowski?
What is the rate for the site-based subs that we have in place? And let me ask another question with that too. Do we have them on all of our campuses right now?
We have 26 right now. For various reasons, a couple are unfilled. We pay them the same as our long-term rate, so they would increase to the 150 per day if they have a teaching certificate and 144 per day if they have a substitute certificate.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there any other board member questions or comments? Thank you. The chair moves to approve action item 4B, increase to Scottsdale Unified School District substitute pay rates as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
Board Member Hartwell seconds. It is moved and seconded that the board approve action item 4B, increase to Scottsdale Unified School District substitute pay rates as presented. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The motion carries 5-0. The board will now move to action item 4C, approval of purchase of student devices. Are there any board member questions or comments? Board Member Beckman.
So I appreciate the background information on the refresh, et cetera. I just had one quick question. What are we doing with our outdated devices, et cetera? Where are they going? Are we getting any money from them? Are they being refurbished? How do we account for them?
Dr. Watt, I believe, is available in the cloud and should be able to answer that question.
Yes, I am here. Good evening. President Greenberg, Vice President Stanowski, governing board members, Dr. Menzel, and Mrs. Wagner. We actually get pretty good use out of those devices once they're no longer a primary learning device. Our team uses any parts that are usable. We pull them apart and store the good parts. So, for example, if a device has a broken screen but the keyboard still works, then that keyboard will be used as a replacement part in another device. So we have a lot of team members really focused on getting the most out of those devices before they are determined to be beyond repair. We also have some uses where maybe it's not the primary student device. For example, a kiosk in a library where the device only boots up to the online library system, so students can use it without logging in to look up information in a secure way. It's not a primary learning device, so we can use older devices for a purpose like that. So we do get as much use as possible out of them. At the point that we can no longer use them is when the operating system is no longer being supported or updated, then it becomes a security risk to have that device on our network. So that's after about 5 or 6 years. We then have to surplus those devices.
One more question regarding, and I may have missed this in the information. What is the warranty on these? I had some information that came to me previously regarding these devices when they were sent home with our children, and certain fees that were attached if they broke a screen or if the cord became damaged, et cetera. Where are we with, as we bring these in? For instance, I think this is going to the Desert Mountain Learning Community. Is there a warranty on them, and what fees are being passed on to our students for damage?
We do purchase a hardware warranty for 3 years. That's for things that are broken that are to no fault of anyone's use, just that, you know, it goes bad for no reason. So those items are replaced under warranty, and there's not any charge. The only time that a charge would be made for damage to a device is if it is done through something that's, you know, with negligence or poor care, or, you know, something where it evidently hasn't been taken care of. And sometimes from a pattern of damage, we can clearly see that might have been the case, but we also rely on partners at the schools who observe how the device is being handled. And so there are occasions when a fee is assessed and then more information is brought forward, and that fee may not actually be assessed, but that's why we do have an optional protection plan for our families, so that those fees don't become burdensome.
Okay, and we are making our families aware of this, right? Like, I think, and Dr. Menzel, you can speak to this. I think you gave me some information before, unless she is better versed in it, that the normal wear and tear is not passed on to our kids any longer, right?
Right, that's correct.
Okay.
And the information is on the website about the device protection plan. Also at the schools, when devices are being rechecked out, that information is sent home with students. And there are other ways for the schools to be communicating that directly with families too.
Okay. Thank you.
Are there any other board member questions or comments? Thank you. The chair moves to approve action item 4C, approval of purchase of student devices as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
Vice President Sinowski seconds. It is moved and seconded that the board approve action item 4C, approval of purchase of student devices as presented. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The motion carries 5-0. The board will now move to action item 4D, approval of award of RFQ number 222126, construction manager at risk, Seymour, for Devon Elementary School to core construction. Are there any comments or questions about action item 4D? Okay, no questions. The chair moves to approve action item 4D, approval of award of RFQ number 222126, construction manager at risk, Seymour, for Devon Elementary School to core construction as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
Vice President Sinowski seconds. It is moved and seconded that the board approve action item 4D, approval of award of RFQ number 222126, construction manager at risk, Seymour, for Devon Elementary School to core construction as presented. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The motion carries 5-0. The board will now move to action item 4E, approval of guaranteed maximum price 2 of 2 for RFQ number 210126, construction manager at risk, Seymour Services for Kiva Elementary School. And we do have a guest presenter, Mr. Dennis Railer.
Greetings. Good evening, President Greenberg, members of the board, Dr. Menzel. We have a slightly modified recommendation that I'll be bringing to you. I wanted to just quickly run through our very brief presentation of Kiva. There's something that probably you haven't seen in a while, the renderings for the school itself. On the left, you've got the 4 school buildings. Remember that Kiva is a full rebuild, scraping all the buildings off the planet and putting new ones on. We're working with OW, Orcott Winslow, and McCarthy Builders on this one. This is a rendering of the front office area looking from the west towards the east. And then this is a view from the east to the west in the parking lot that will be shared between the Presbyterian Church and Scottsdale Schools. And then this is inside the courtyard, looking at the library and the Kiva for the namesake of the school. And here's a representation of the cafeteria and inside the courtyard area. So I'll just bring up the schedule of values. So if there's any discussion on that. We are looking at, and remember, we've already approved GMP 1, and I've showed in that separate document, which I do have, if there's questions, and I can bring that up, the total spend commitment for Kiva. But tonight's action is to approve GMP number 2 at $19,863,032. That is the guaranteed maximum price for the balance of the project. I did show the credit that we'll be getting for GMP 1 that will be applied to GMP 2. And so any questions on that?
Are there any board member questions or comments on what Mr. Rayler has presented? Vice President Sinowski.
I just want to make note of the thoughtful questions that have been presented prior to this evening's meeting and the responses that you have provided for us, which has led to an easier process of understanding all the details coming in. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Board Member Beckman.
Thank you for stating that. Mr. Rayler, can you just do a quick summary of why the differential? I mean, I think the public at large understands the supply chain issues and the price increases that the whole world has seen lately, and certainly these rebuilds are no stranger to that type of environment in general, much less where we are right now. But can you speak to that for a moment? Because we are different than what you originally brought to us.
Right. So the original budget for Kiva back in 2016 was about $16 million. And we worked real hard, saving money wherever we could, bringing more dollars to the rebuilds. There was substantial savings when Navajo had its fire and the restoration and the insurance. So we've pieced together all the dollars that we can to make this be what it is. We're about $1.5 million over budget on the GMP itself. And as I've shown you, and I guess I'll just pull that up so everyone can see that. On our spend, so this portion of the Excel document shows the original GMP number 1, and then GMP number 2, and then that calculation with all funds that we're spending on that campus. And for the first time ever, in the time that I've been managing the bond, we're actually having to go to outside funds to pay for some of the stuff in this project. So we're using some food service money. We're using other 611 capital override funds. We're using other 610 funds that we would normally not do. We had absorbed that in the bond in previous years. But knowing that we were where we were, and the total spend for Kiva at $25,809, which is just shy of what we spent on Hohokam, in this tumultuous time is actually not so bad. It is more than we had originally planned, but when you consider some of the supplies are 10 months out, or 12 months out, we're being told that they aren't going to ship for 10 months, and oh, by the way, we'll give you a price in 10 months. I had forwarded a letter that I had gotten from Shaw, the manufacturers of carpeting, increasing their numbers as of January 1st by 10%. That is the 4th increase that they have given us just this year. So we are really lucky to have the McCarthy team on our side. They've been working really hard to get us to where we are. Is it perfect? Is it where we really wanted to be? No, but we'll get it done. One of the follow-up questions, if I may, was, okay, well, what are we going to do about Devon and Pueblo? We're bringing, as we did today, we're bringing that general contractor on as early as we possibly can to help guide us and help guide the architects to make sure that we're not speccing things that are out of bounds, that are expensive, that are long lead items. And we're doing everything we can without having a crystal ball to know what's next, because God knows we would have never been able to guess that we would be in this situation today. So we're bringing those contractors on as early as we can to try and manage that scope, to manage everything that we can. We've had talks about the capacity of the school. How big are we going to build it? When we did Hohokam, we really didn't know. The Yavapai-Hohokam relationship and all of that, how big do you build it? And so we built it with some assumptions. There might be a different decision tomorrow that says, well, we're going to do something differently with that school. Who knows? So unfortunately, I don't have a good crystal ball. I got one of those 8 balls, but that really doesn't work very well. So it has been a struggle, and we have been at it night and day with McCarthy and Orcutt Winslow trying to get this to where we want it to be. So we think we've got a good product in the design. We think that the community is going to be thrilled, and we're going to get this thing done. And one of the reasons that we are here today and not 2 weeks from now or 4 weeks from now is that they have a very short window to get this school built. The expectation is that we're going to be in that building come August of '22. And that's a big ask. So with that, I will make my recommendation that is slightly different than what was provided, because we do have a few hanging chads, if you will. It is my recommendation that the governing board approve the guaranteed maximum price, GMP number 2, for request for qualifications RFQ number 210126 for the Kiva Elementary School Rebuild Remodel Project to McCarthy Builders, Inc. in the amount of $19,863,032. There are a few remaining items, and this is what's different in my recommendation. There are a few remaining items included in this GMP2 that require additional vetting and conversation between SUSD and McCarthy Builders. It is not expected that this work will materially affect the lump sum of the GMP presented this evening. Should there be any movement in the GMP beyond this evening's recommendation, the district's administration will bring that back to the governing board for consideration. Yes.
So having said that, I'm sorry, did I?
No, it's fine.
Your basis of the GMP2 documents and McCarthy receiving the updated GMP set dated for the permitting, are you talking about that here? You said that it was submitted to the town of Paradise Valley for permit review, but it had not been incorporated into the GMP due to scheduling restraints. Are we going to expect anything additional costs from this?
No, ma'am.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know before.
Yeah, just in the agenda item, I just wanted to make clear that things are really progressing, and that the time is now. We need to, as soon as that permit comes in, we need to start digging some trenches and start building that building, get it going upwards.
Are there any other board member questions or comments? Board member Hartwells.
Just to clarify then, the recommendation is that if the number changes as a result of these hanging chads, we will be apprised of that. It will not.
If it goes up $50, you will know.
Okay, thank you.
And if it goes down, you'll also know.
Well, that would be fantastic.
Are there any other board member questions or comments? Mr. Rayler, so the main change is that in one of the paragraphs, you noted that any expenditure outside the limits of more than $100,000 would be brought to us. The change is that is now $0. Any change will be brought to us.
No, the change, that in the actual agenda item, the referenced items are these other expenses. For instance, if the asbestos abatement, if we get the pricing, because we're not going to do the asbestos abatement until next June.
Okay.
So when we get pricing for the asbestos
Okay.
abatement, it's over 100,000, it's coming back to the board. When we get ready to buy the kitchen equipment, it'll be over 100,000, we're coming back to the board. If the structured cabling, which we're going to do as owner provided, when that comes in over 100,000, we're coming back to the board. So it's those items that will be coming back for the board. The owner provided items, furniture, fixture, and equipment. If we have playground structures, because we've taken that on as the owner, we'll bring that back to the board. What you're approving today, this 19 million, is strictly the GMP for McCarthy.
So only if those items are over 100,000, they'll come. I guess what I have to admit, I'm a little lost here. Are you saying that we're approving the 19 million and that any change in cost will be brought to us, or changes in costs that are only over $100,000?
So as it relates to the GMP, we have a few discussion points that we need to work through. And if the GMP, that 19 million changes one way or another, there'll be a conversation to let you guys know how we worked it out. The expectation is that we will be at that 19 million or slightly below.
Okay.
That's my expectation. What's Tyler saying back there? Yeah, he's good. It'll be under.
Okay, and there are no anticipated expenditures outside of the GMP? Or are you saying that those items are outside of the GMP?
These items in green
Right.
are outside of the GMP.
But we have to have them,
Yeah.
right?
And
So-
those will,
so-
if they're over 100,000, be brought back to the
Right.
governing board for approval per board policy.
Okay.
Correct.
So when
All
you
right.
see them again, it's just a reminder that they were outside of GMP. Tonight, when we approved it, you might not see them for 6 or 9 months, and it could be easy to forget that, well, wasn't that included? And in fact, it wasn't. It was promised that it'll come back to the governing board at a proper time.
And the reason that these are outside of the GMP is if we included them with the GMP, if McCarthy owned those and needed to do that work, well, they put their fees on top of that, right? So their contractor fee, taxes, all of that. So that was a cost savings effort for us. We will still have them manage it, but we're going to do the early legwork. We're going to do the procurement. We're going to bring it back to the board. We're going to pay for it, and we won't have the general contractor's fees on top of it.
Would these normally be included in the GMP? For example, previous GMPs that we've approved?
Some of them, yes, some of them, no.
Okay.
So very specifically, the kitchen equipment has normally been included in the bond dollars, but not part of the GMP. We've always, as the owner, provided that equipment for the job. So the differential in what we're looking at today is I'm actually showing you dollars that we are spending outside of bond that we have not really done before. We've typically used bond money to take care of all of those things.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that clarification because I wasn't following along. Are there any other board member questions or comments? So since this is an amendment, we would have to approve this as amended, correct? I mean, is this an amendment to the GMP itself?
Yes.
Okay.
Just
It's not amendment to the GMP. The recommendation and the dollar amount that we're proposing is the same as what you saw on the first. What Mr. Rayler added was that clarification that there are a few outstanding items, and it's a commitment on the part of the administration that should there be a change, that'll be brought back to the governing board. On the GMP amount, we don't know what that's going to be. We wanted to let you know, in order to keep the project moving, that there's still a couple of items that they're working on.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions or comments? The chair moves to approve action item 4E, approval of guaranteed maximum price 2 of 2 for RFQ number 210126, construction manager at risk Seymour services for Kiva Elementary School as presented. Is there a second?
Second.
Board Member Lindsay seconds. It is moved and seconded that the board approve action item 4E, approval of guaranteed maximum price 2 of 2 for RFQ number 210126, construction manager at risk Seymour services for Kiva Elementary School. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The motion carries 5-0.
Thank you.
Thank you. The board will now move to action item 4F, district vote for the proposed amendment to the Arizona School Boards Association ASBA bylaws. Are there any questions or comments about the proposed amendment? Board Member Hartwells.
Thank you. I would just ask if Vice President Sinowski could summarize what the bylaw change is for the community. Thank you.
Does everyone have it pulled up in front of them?
I do.
It's in our board docs. Oh, you don't have it. Is there a way to put it up on the screen?
Jonathan, can we put up the bylaw change that's an attachment?
Okay.
I can email you the link. Would that be, do you need that?
And I can provide a basic summary if you would like while we're waiting. Maybe we don't even need to show it. It's basically expanding the representation of who is making decisions for our county, and it would be including, the proposal is 1 for Hispanic representation and 1 for Native representation.
Thank you. And the reason I'm asking is that I think it's important that the community be able to see what these changes are, just to avoid any confusion.
Yeah. It's basically expanding voice of decision-making.
That's perfect. Thank you, Jonathan. Are there any questions or comments about this proposal? As you can see, the ASBA Board of Directors does recommend a yes vote on this amendment. With no further questions or comments, the chair moves to approve action item 4F, district vote for the proposed amendment to the Arizona School Boards Association ASBA bylaws. Is there a second?
Second.
Vice President Sinowski seconds. It is moved and seconded that the board approve action item 4F as presented, district vote for the proposed amendment to the Arizona School Boards Association ASBA bylaws. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The motion carries 5-0. The board will now move to action item 5A, adjournment of the special meeting. The chair moves to adjourn the special meeting of the Scottsdale Unified Number 48 Governing Board on October 5th, 2021 at 7:54 p.m. Is there a second? Board Member Beckman seconds. It is moved and seconded that the board adjourn this special meeting of the Scottsdale Unified Number 48 Governing Board. All those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. The motion carries 5-0, and the meeting is so adjourned. Thank you.